Since we have seen how a biological neuron looks like, the big question here is how does a biological neural network, get built up, right? So a neural network here is nothing but it's basically an interconnection. It's basically an interconnection of neurons. So if this is my cell body, right? These are my dendrites. These are my axons. Right? These are my dendrites. These are my axons. This is my cell body. Okay, I'll just put it as cell body, right? So it gets some inputs. It has some outputs. These outputs get connected to other neurons. Similarly, this neuron will have some more inputs from other neurons, right? So all this is literally what a biological neural network is, right? So this can have, so given any cell body, it can have, it'll obviously have dendrites as inputs and axons as outputs, right? And this interconnection of various neurons, various biological neurons, is your biological neural network. And the big question here is, how are these biological neural networks formed? It's a very, very interesting study in neuroscience with almost 50 plus years of research which has gone into it ever since modern microscopes came into existence. It's a phenomenal field in itself. Okay, let's understand this. So the most important thing, so when you're born, you have a bunch of neurons, right? When you're born. So let me show you a nice example here. So this is an example from Harvard's child development, from how child development happens. So this is actually a neural scan. So what they've taken is they've taken a small piece of a brain. Suppose if this is your big brain, you've taken a small piece, a small slice of your brain, and they visualized each individual neuron under a microscope. And this research is very old. This research was done in 1959. So it is nothing new. And this is basically from the human cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex is the front part of your brain. So if this is your whole brain, it is the front part of your brain where most of your thinking and cognition happen. So when a kid is at birth, right, look at this. When a kid is just born, there are some neurons. So look at each of these. This is a cell body, this is a cell, and this is actual scans, okay, under a microscope. Here is a cell body here. Here is a cell body, here is a cell body, etc., etc. There are some of these dendrites and axons. But if you look at it, the network is not fully formed. The network is very sparse. When I say the network is sparse, what I mean is that there are very few connections from one neuron to other neuron. For example, from this neuron to this neuron, there is one connection. But there are no connections here. There are no connections here. There are very few connections. Okay, so this network, so this biological neural network is sparsely connected at birth. But what happens is by the time the kid is 6 years old, which means in the first 6 years, right, the network becomes super densely connected. This is very dense. If you notice here, there are millions and millions and millions of connections here. So what's happening here is, so let's look at it mathematically, right? So you have your neurons at birth, right? Each of these, let's say, are your cell bodies, right? So at birth, what happens is there are some connections formed, not many connections, right? Maybe there are just inputs here and some output here, not very well connected. Okay. So mathematically speaking, what does these connections are? These connections are nothing but weights, right? I can think of them as weights. This is W1, this is weight 2, this is weight 3. Right now I can say that the weight between this and this is 0. Right? When I say the weight is 0, what it means is that these two neurons are not connected. Right? So, but if let's say there is a weight of, let's say, 2.4, which means it's connected. But let's assume there is another weight. Let's assume there is another weight here of 4.8. So the more weight there is, the more thickly connected, the more densely connected this edge is, or this connection is, than the other connection. If you notice here, there are some connections which are very dense. I mean, this is the actual thing, right? If you look at this edge is very, very thick as compared to this edge, which is very, very thin, right? So if you notice again, I'll remove so this edge, just look at this edge. This edge is very, very thick, while this edge is very thin. Similarly, this edge is very thick. This edge is very thick. So there are some edges. Similarly, this edge, if you see, this edge is very thick, while this edge is thinner. So there are some edges which are thick. There are some edges which are thin. right? We can quantify or we can put it in mathematical terms what thick and thin are by putting numbers on edges. So the higher the number, the thicker the edge. And the minimum value of any edge or edge weight is 0, which implies that there is no edge. For example, in this case, between this neuron and this neuron, the edge weight is 0 because there is no edge present at all. Right? So what's happening is from the time of birth up to the time a kid is 6 years old, right? There is a lot of brain development that's happening, right? Of course, just imagine from the time a kid is born to the time a kid is 6 years old, they learn language, right? They learn to recognize speech. They learn to recognize objects. They learn, within language, they learn alphabet, they learn sentence formation. There are lots and lots and lots of things that a kid's brain learns from the time they're 0 years old to the time they're 6 years old. There is massive amount of learning. And learning biologically, learning, what we call as biological learning, is nothing but, in neuroscience, it is basically connecting neurons with edges. Okay, this edge formation, forming new edges, forming new connections, is what we refer to as colloquially, or in our commonsensical world, what we call learning in simple human terms, is nothing but, in neuroscience, it's connecting lots of neurons with different weights, right? Some thicker and some thinner. Okay, so but look at this. This is the fun part. Between the time a kid is 6 years old to the time a kid is 14 years old, you'll notice that the density is starting to decrease slightly. So by the time a kid comes to teenage, right, this is like the teenage brain, right? Teenage brain, what happens is there are lots of connections that are useless here. Okay, probably the kid has formed some random, because of his experiences, right? So some of these connections may be useless. And remember, the more connections, this is very important, the more connections or the more edges in a human brain, the more calories it will require. The more calories and energy it requires to sustain these connections. Because when there isn't enough food or calories for the human brain to exist, okay, because the more dense the connections, to survive each of these connections is an electrochemical reaction which requires energy, which requires calories, right? So the brain, when it evolved, right, it said, okay, there are lots of connections, some of them not very useful, so let's remove some of the edges which are not really useful. And that's what happens by the time a kid is 14 years old. And as we grow older and older, by the time you come to 80 years of age, right, there is neural degeneration. Okay, there is something called as neural degeneration. What happens is, because our whole body itself is getting weak, our brain also becomes weak, and some of these connections die. And when some of these connections die, as you might have seen in some of the older people, they stop recognizing people. They can't hear properly, or they can't communicate properly. They can't recognize objects. Sometimes they can't even recognize their own family members. That's what happens when you grow old. Some of these connections get degenerated, or they die. Just like any other cell in the human body, when brains die, your cognition, your ability to think is lost. Okay? So of course, let's not go to the sad part. This is the fun part of a human life, where you're learning a lot. Now, coming to this, so the big question here is, how are these edges formed? Right? How are these edges formed? Now, what happens is, in the first 6 years, a human consumes a lot of data. He or she consumes a lot of data. Let's see what all data he or she is consuming. They're consuming visual data, right? They see the world. When they're born, they haven't seen the world. They're still in the mother's womb. The moment they are born, they start capturing data visually. Similarly with audio, they start hearing to their parents. They start hearing to their grandparents and to their family. So they acquire language. And of course, parents, family explicitly teaches them new things. So there is also other sensory input, like they start touching things. They start walking. So they understand what geometry is, what 3D geometry is, right? When they start walking. So all these are sensory inputs. And based on these inputs, all these inputs are nothing but data. Like if you think about it from a computational standpoint, all these vision, audio, your family teaching you language, your family teaching you about objects, your sense of touch, smell, all of this is nothing but data in computer science, right? So a child's brain takes a lot of data. So when you input data to this, and there is an algorithm that is biologically designed to train. So as soon as they start consuming a lot of this data, new connections are formed. And the most important thing is these new connections are formed based on data, not randomly, right? Based on what they observe. For example, if you take a small kid, if you take a Japanese kid, versus an Indian kid, right? The Japanese kid will learn Japanese language. The Indian kid will learn one of the many Indian languages. For example, my mother tongue is Telugu. Okay, so when I was probably from my birth to 6 years of age, I became fairly fluent in my mother tongue because that's what I've seen all my family speak around me. Similarly, a Japanese kid will have different data and hence different connections will be formed, right? So the grammar in Japanese is very different from the grammar in Telugu, right? The sounds, the vocabulary, everything is different. The complexity of vocabulary, sometimes even writing of language is different, right? So what happens is because the data sets are different for both of us, new connections are formed differently. And these connections, the core idea of these connections is these connections are formed. So look at it from a biological standpoint. These connections are formed based on the data that is provided to the kid. And most importantly, these connections enable the kid to succeed and survive, right? For example, let me give you an example, right? So imagine there is a neural circuitry like this, okay? And let's assume the kid touches something which is hot, okay, when they're 3 or 4 years old. The moment they touch something which is hot, let's assume I touch a hot plate, right? It suddenly gives me pain. It generates physical pain. So within my neural circuitry, there will be some set of neurons which basically learns this behavior that if I touch hot things, it will create a lot of pain for me. So don't touch them. So this physical thing is learned by experience, either by physical experience or by your family telling you not to touch, right? Because the family creates fear in you. They say, oh, don't touch that, that will hurt you. Of course, kids being very curious, they'll try it once. All of us touched a hot plate at some point in our own lives. Because even though our mother and parents or father have told us that, we are very, very experimentative as kids. We want to really see if it really hurts us. But once it hurts us, this neural circuitry will get very strong, right? Because now this weight will increase because I know that the pain is massive. As soon as I touch a hot plate, it gives me a small burn, which hurts me a lot. So my neural circuitry, there will be some set of neurons which will learn that hot plates should not be touched because they create pain. And this relationship is learned internally in our brains, right? Imagine if I'm from India. Nothing to imagine, I'm actually from India. I was born here. As a kid, I never saw snow. So I don't know how snow feels. Okay, I've never seen a snowfall being from south of India, which is a very warm tropical climate, right? So between the age that I'm 0 to 6, I've never experienced snow. I've never seen snow. So I don't know what snow feels like or what happens if I walk in snow for too long. I don't know that snow even slips. Similarly, if you take an American kid who is 0 years old, living not in California, but let's say somewhere in Midwest where it snows a lot, that American kid, okay, or a Canadian kid, okay, or a North European kid will quickly learn. An Indian kid will never understand what snow means. While an American kid or a North American kid, to be very specific, a Canadian kid, because it snows a lot, they'll quickly learn what snow is and what they should and should not do with snow because of their experiences, right? So all learning, literally, all biological learning is nothing but weights on the neural connections. It's basically what we're literally doing is we have this machinery of neurons. Okay, what learning basically is nothing but connecting these edges and First of all, weight basically could be zero, which means if the weight is zero, there is no connection. But as the weight increases, there are new connections that are formed. Right? Even when you're learning this course, there are new connections that are being formed in your brain, which help you learn what is happening. Right? So all biological learning that we know of is mostly learning weights and connections in your biological neural network. We will take this very important idea. Again, this is a very simplified idea, but I'm not a neuroscientist myself. Some neuroscientists might laugh, who know neuroscience very well, might laugh at this analogy, but this is a very, very simplified analogy. This is a very, very simplified way of understanding it. And this connects very well with our artificial neural networks. Right? Even in artificial neural network, learning is nothing but connecting various single neurons with edges and with some weights on them. That's what learning is all about. And learning happens through data, which means all this weight learning, even in an artificial neural network or a computational neural network, is nothing but weight manipulation. Okay, we'll see how all of this pans out through the rest of this chapter and the next few chapters.